Imagine this. You've just confessed your love to someone, and instead of a romantic response, you're immediately arrested, publicly humiliated, and possibly executed. Welcome to medieval romance, where falling in love was considered a dangerous mental illness, and marriage was a business transaction, where the bride and groom often met for the first time at their own wedding. If you think modern dating is brutal, wait until you hear what passed for romance in an era where love potions were literally poison, and happily ever after usually meant one of you died within 5 years. Everything you think you know about medieval love and marriage is wrong. Those fairy tales about knights and princesses, those romantic ballads about courtly love, they're all carefully constructed lies designed to hide a reality so dark that even Hollywood wouldn't dare show it. What I'm about to reveal will destroy every romantic notion you've ever had about the Middle Ages and make you realize that our modern concept of love would have been considered pure insanity by medieval standards. Before we dive into this romantic nightmare, make sure you hit that subscribe button, because what you're about to learn isn't taught in any history class, and trust me, you'll want to share this disturbing knowledge with everyone you know. Let's start with the most shocking truth of all. Romantic love was literally considered a disease in medieval times. Medieval physicians had a specific diagnosis for it: love sickness, or amor herios, and they treated it like we treat cancer today. The symptoms? Obsessive thoughts about another person, loss of appetite, sleeplessness, and emotional instability. The prescribed cures: bloodletting, cold baths, and in extreme cases, surgical removal of part of the brain. Yes, you heard that right. Medieval doctors would perform lobotomies on people who fell too deeply in love. The medical texts from this period are absolutely terrifying. One prominent medieval physician, Constantine the African, wrote detailed treatises on how romantic love literally rots the brain from the inside out. He claimed that lovers' brains would develop black bile that would eventually kill them if left untreated. The cure involved purging the body of all romantic feelings through a combination of torture, starvation, and chemical treatments that were essentially medieval antidepressants made from mercury and other toxic substances. But here's where it gets even more twisted. The few people who did experience what we might call romantic love were forced to hide it like a shameful secret. There are surviving letters from medieval lovers that read like the correspondence between underground resistance fighters. They used coded language, secret meeting places, and elaborate deception networks just to exchange a few words of affection. Getting caught could mean social ruin, physical punishment, or even death. Now let's talk about what marriage actually looked like in this romantic wasteland. Marriage in the Middle Ages was a financial transaction, pure and simple. Families negotiated bride prices and dowries with the same cold calculation that modern corporations use for hostile takeovers. The bride and groom were essentially human merchandise being exchanged to cement business deals, forge political alliances, or consolidate property holdings. The marriage negotiations were conducted like medieval board meetings. Families would gather with scribes, witnesses, and legal advisors to hammer out the terms of the human exchange. They'd discuss the bride's value, her virginity, her family's wealth, her potential fertility, and even her life expectancy. Yes, they literally calculated how long she was likely to live and factored that into the marriage price. If she was expected to die young, her family had to offer additional compensation. The wedding ceremony itself was a grotesque parody of what we consider marriage today. The bride and groom would often see each other for the first time when they met at the altar. There was no courtship, no dating period, no getting to know each other. They were complete strangers being legally bound together for life based entirely on their family's financial negotiations. But the true horror began after the ceremony. The concept of marital rape didn't exist in medieval law because wives were considered their husband's property. A woman had no legal right to refuse her husband anything, including sexual demands that would be considered torture by modern standards. Medieval marriage manuals, yes, they had instruction books for this stuff, included detailed descriptions of a husband's rights that would make your skin crawl. The wedding night was often a traumatic experience that set the tone for the entire marriage. Brides were expected to submit to their husbands regardless of their own feelings, physical comfort, or emotional state. Many marriages began with what was essentially legalized assault, and this was considered completely normal. The bride's tears and terror were seen as proof of her virtue and innocence. Let me tell you about Eleanor of Castile, who was married to Edward I of England in 1254. Their marriage was arranged when she was 10 years old, but the wedding was delayed until she was 13. When she finally met Edward for the first time at their wedding, she was so terrified that she fainted during the ceremony. The wedding guests found this amusing and took it as a sign that she was appropriately modest. She spent her wedding night in what contemporary accounts describe as a state of bridal terror that lasted for months. The legal framework surrounding medieval marriage was designed to trap both parties, but especially women, in unions that were often little better than legalized slavery. Divorce was virtually impossible, and even separation required papal approval, which was granted so rarely that most people never even attempted it. You were stuck with your spouse for life, no matter how abusive, incompatible, or miserable the relationship became. Domestic violence was not only legal, but encouraged as a necessary tool for maintaining proper household order. Medieval law specifically granted husbands the right to physically correct their wives, and there were detailed guidelines about what types of violence were acceptable. A husband could legally beat his wife as long as he didn't use a stick thicker than his thumb. Yes, that's where the phrase rule of thumb comes from. The psychological toll of these marriages was devastating. Medieval records are full of references to wives suffering from what they called marriage melancholy, a condition we would now recognize as severe depression. Many women simply shut down emotionally, becoming what their families described as living ghosts, physically present but mentally absent from their own lives. But here's the part that will really blow your mind. The concept of marital love was not just discouraged, it was considered dangerous to the social order. Medieval religious leaders preached that husbands and wives who loved each other too much were committing a form of adultery against God. They believed that excessive affection between spouses distracted from religious devotion and could lead to spiritual damnation. The church had specific guidelines about how much emotion was appropriate in marriage. Too little affection was considered cold and uncharitable, but too much was seen as sinful and potentially heretical. Couples were literally expected to maintain precise emotional distance from each other, close enough to fulfill their reproductive duties, but not so close that they forgot their higher spiritual obligations. This created a bizarre dynamic where married couples were expected to be intimate strangers. They shared beds, produced children together, and managed households as a team, but they were discouraged from developing the kind of emotional bonds that we consider essential to healthy relationships. Many medieval marriages resembled business partnerships more than romantic unions. The sexual aspect of medieval marriage was equally disturbing. The church taught that sexual pleasure, even within marriage, was inherently sinful. Couples were instructed to approach marital relations with the same grim sense of duty that they might approach paying taxes or attending confession. Any sign of enjoyment, especially from the wife, was considered evidence of moral corruption. Medieval marriage manuals included detailed instructions about proper sexual conduct that read like military regulations. There were rules about acceptable positions, appropriate frequency, and even specific prayers that were supposed to be recited during intercourse to minimize the sinful nature of the act. The idea that sex could be an expression of love and intimacy was completely foreign to medieval thinking. The reproductive pressure on medieval wives was crushing. Their primary value was their ability to produce male heirs, and failure to do so quickly could result in divorce, abandonment, or worse. Women who couldn't conceive within the first year of marriage were often subjected to brutal fertility treatments that included forced consumption of toxic substances, painful physical procedures, and psychological torture designed to open their wombs. Pregnancy offered no respite from the brutality of medieval marriage. Pregnant wives were still expected to fulfill all their household duties and submit to their husbands' demands regardless of their physical condition. Maternal mortality rates were astronomical, and many women spent their entire adult lives either pregnant, recovering from childbirth, or mourning dead infants. The child mortality rate made the emotional landscape of medieval marriage even more bleak. Couples were advised not to become too attached to their children because the likelihood of losing them was so high. This emotional distance extended to the relationship between spouses as well. Investing too much emotion in any relationship was seen as setting yourself up for devastating loss. But here's something that might surprise you. Despite all these restrictions and horrors, some medieval couples did manage to find genuine love within their marriages. We have surviving letters between husbands and wives that reveal deep affection, mutual respect, and real emotional intimacy. But these couples had to hide their feelings from the outside world and conduct their loving relationship like a secret affair. The story of Abelard and Heloise is probably the most famous example of medieval love gone wrong. Peter Abelard was a prominent scholar and philosopher, and Heloise was his brilliant student. They fell deeply in love and began a secret affair that scandalized medieval Paris when it was discovered. Heloise became pregnant, and they married in secret. But when the marriage was revealed, Heloise's family had Abelard castrated and forced Heloise into a convent. Their love letters, written years later, are heart-wrenching testimonies to a love that society couldn't tolerate. The economic realities of medieval life made genuine romantic relationships nearly impossible for most people. Marriage was primarily an economic survival strategy, and romantic feelings were seen as a dangerous luxury that most people simply couldn't afford. Families needed to pool resources, combine land holdings, and create strategic alliances just to survive. Love was irrelevant to these calculations. The social class differences made the situation even more complex. Noble marriages were entirely about politics and property, with no consideration given to the personal feelings of the individuals involved. Peasant marriages had slightly more room for personal choice, but economic necessity usually trumped emotional preference even at the lowest social levels. The role of matchmakers in medieval society was crucial and disturbing. Professional matchmakers were essentially human traffickers who specialized in arranging marriages based purely on financial and social considerations. They maintained detailed records of available marriage candidates, including information about their family's wealth, their physical appearance, their fertility history, and even their expected lifespan. Love never entered into their calculations. The concept of adultery in medieval marriage was fascinating and horrifying. While husbands were generally free to pursue extramarital relationships, wives faced death if caught in adultery. But here's the twisted part. The definition of adultery for women included emotional attachment to anyone other than their husband. A wife could be executed not just for sexual infidelity, but for simply showing too much affection to a friend, relative, or even her own children. The legal penalties for adultery were designed to terrorize women into complete emotional submission. Public execution was common, but even more frequent were punishments designed to humiliate and degrade adulterous wives. They might be forced to walk naked through the town, have their hair shaved off, or be branded with marks identifying them as adulteresses. The psychological torture was often worse than the physical punishment. But here's where the hypocrisy becomes truly staggering. While wives were being executed for emotional infidelity, husbands were openly maintaining mistresses, visiting prostitutes, and fathering illegitimate children with complete social acceptance. Medieval law specifically protected men's right to seek sexual satisfaction outside marriage while simultaneously demanding absolute fidelity from their wives. The cultural mythology around courtly love was essentially elaborate propaganda designed to distract from the brutal reality of actual medieval relationships. Those romantic stories about knights pining for unattainable ladies were fantasies that had nothing to do with how real people lived. Courtly love was a literary game played by the aristocracy, while real marriages were business arrangements enforced through violence and legal coercion. The troubadour tradition, which gave us many of our romantic ideals about medieval love, was actually a form of social control. These romantic ballads taught people to channel their emotional desires into safe, socially acceptable fantasies rather than seeking real romantic relationships that might disrupt the established order. It was medieval emotional manipulation disguised as entertainment. The medical understanding of love and sexuality in the Middle Ages was based on completely incorrect assumptions about human anatomy and psychology. Medieval physicians believed that women's bodies were inherently inferior and that their emotions were controlled by their wombs, which they thought moved around inside the body, causing hysteria and other female problems. This pseudoscience was used to justify the complete subjugation of women in marriage. The religious justification for medieval marriage practices was equally warped. The church taught that marriage was a necessary evil designed to control sexual desire and prevent greater sins. The ideal Christian life was celibacy, and marriage was seen as a compromise for people who lacked the spiritual strength to remain chaste. This attitude poisoned the emotional atmosphere of medieval marriages from the very beginning. The inheritance laws surrounding medieval marriage created additional layers of tragedy. Women typically lost all legal rights to their family's property when they married, becoming entirely dependent on their husband's goodwill for survival. Widows could inherit their husband's property, but they often faced immediate pressure to remarry, starting the cycle of abuse all over again with a new husband. The international marriage trade was a thriving business that treated women like exotic commodities to be shipped across Europe for the convenience of male buyers. Princesses and noblewomen were literally cargo in diplomatic negotiations, transported hundreds of miles to marry complete strangers in foreign countries where they didn't speak the language or understand the customs. The psychological defense mechanisms developed by people trapped in loveless medieval marriages were heartbreaking. Many developed what we would now recognize as dissociative disorders, mentally separating themselves from their physical experiences to survive the emotional trauma. Others channeled their need for love into religious devotion, becoming obsessed with spiritual relationships as a substitute for human intimacy. The impact on children growing up in these emotionally barren households was devastating. Medieval children learned from birth that love was dangerous, emotions were weakness, and relationships were primarily about power and control. This created a cycle of emotional damage that perpetuated itself across generations. But here's the reality check you need. Not every medieval marriage was a complete nightmare. Some couples did manage to develop genuine affection and partnership over time. The key difference was that they had to discover love within marriage rather than choosing marriage because of love. Some even managed to create remarkably successful relationships based on mutual respect, shared goals, and gradually developed emotional intimacy. The regional variations in medieval marriage customs reveal that the brutal practices I've described weren't universal, but they were widespread enough to represent the dominant pattern across most of Europe. Some cultures had slightly more humane approaches to marriage and family life, but the overall trend was toward treating marriage as an economic and political institution rather than an emotional relationship. The survival strategies developed by medieval women to navigate these impossible marriages were ingenious and heartbreaking. They created secret networks of support, developed coded languages to communicate their true feelings, and found creative ways to carve out small spaces of autonomy within systems designed to control them completely. The long-term consequences of the medieval marriage system extended far beyond the Middle Ages. Many of the attitudes and practices I've described persisted well into the modern era, and some remnants still influence our thinking about love and marriage today. The idea that women should be submissive in relationships, that marriage is primarily about economic security, and that romantic love is somehow frivolous or dangerous, these are all medieval concepts that continue to shape modern relationships in subtle but significant ways. The literature and art that survived from this period tell the story of medieval marriage in heartbreaking detail. Love songs from the era are filled with references to secrecy, suffering, and impossible longing. Marriage portraits show couples standing stiffly apart, often looking in different directions, their faces expressionless masks that hide whatever emotions they might have felt. So there you have it, the brutal reality of love and marriage in the Middle Ages, stripped of all romantic mythology and fairy tale nonsense. This wasn't an era of chivalrous knights and swooning maidens. It was a time when love was considered a mental illness, marriage was a form of legalized slavery, and emotional intimacy was seen as a dangerous threat to social stability. The next time someone talks about traditional marriage values or romanticizes historical relationships, remember what traditional marriage actually looked like. Remember the millions of people who lived and died without ever experiencing the kind of love that we take for granted today. Their stories deserve to be told, not to shock or depress us, but to help us appreciate how far we've come and to ensure that we never go back to treating love as a luxury and marriage as a business transaction. Now, if you'll excuse me, I'm going to go appreciate the fact that I can date someone for years, live with them before marriage, and actually choose my own spouse based on compatibility and mutual affection rather than my father's business interests. If this journey into the romantic wasteland of medieval Europe has left you as disturbed as it should, Make sure you subscribe for more historical truths that will make you grateful to be alive in the 21st century. Because trust me, the more you learn about the past, the more you'll appreciate the present.